Hi. With a brief note of thanks to Ridgemont for facilitating the gathering here together. Just very briefly, I'll introduce you guys because we've got a good representation of the various professions in the business here in the perspective. So, Tim Seal, Head of Construction for Ridgemont. Again, thank you. Mike Feasey, Relationship Director for Secure Trust Bank, so the money man. And Brian Baker, from partner at Moore Kingston Smith, so another money man, but you do the counting and the measuring, as it were. And I'm from Adair, Stuart Owen, and we're a quantity surveying firm, and we do a lot of work in the dispute and conflict sector. So we're seeing a lot of the consequences of inflation, insolvency, and the effects that it has on the construction process at the moment. So, Tim, starting with yourself, if I may. Obviously, one of the concerns that developers have at the moment is cost certainty, which is very, very difficult. Insolvency rates are doubling at the moment compared to this time last year. And that seems to be strongly in correlation with material cost inflation as well as labour. So from a point of view of a contractor, who obviously we see as being right in the middle of it, what do you think contractors can do to protect against inflation and the risks associated with that?
Thanks very much. So one of the most popular ways of trying to address that is through a fluctuating price contract. The best examples of those, perhaps certainly the most widely known, are those that appear at the back of the JCT standard forms, where there are typically, until recently, there had typically been 3 options, although 2 of them have now been removed from the standard form. But those fluctuating price clauses in building contracts allow the 2 parties, the contractor and the developer, in advance of the work starting, to provide a mechanism by which inflation but also deflation over the life of the project can be managed. And that takes the form of various things such as tax, price of materials, and excise duties and so on. All of those things, if they fluctuate over the price or over the course of the build, there is a mechanism there to allow the contractor to be paid more or to have to account for more if it works the other way, so managing inflation and deflation. So the rules and the mechanisms by which the contract sum has been priced at the outset, if the rules that underpin that calculation change, causing rates to go up or prices to go up or the other way around, then there's a mechanism built in for the parties to adjust the contract sum. And that's a good way of managing those risks when you go into a contract in a time of instability like at the moment. So that's an example. Fluctuation clauses under JCT contracts.
Okay. From a QS point of view, our experience is that we see fluctuation clauses generally struck through, but they're very rarely carried, and they're enabling them sounds like an exposure for the client point of view. And one of the things that we've discussed in our business is that clients misunderstand the idea of cost certainty with design and build contracts, for example. They get certainty, but they may not be getting best value. In terms of protection under the contract itself, fluctuation clauses, where are the real risks and where are the real sort of extensions that might, if you like, trigger developers to have most concern, would you think?
Outside of the fluctuation side of things, under any construction contract, where the greatest areas of risk?
Yeah, I think if you can think of examples of that.
Well, at the moment, it's going to be the health of the contractor. That's going to be a big issue. I mean, if the contractor starts to come under extreme financial pressure, which many are and which many more probably will over the next year or so, then that's a big risk because it doesn't benefit anyone, least of all the employer, if the contractor starts to struggle financially, which is part of the reason for having the clause I talked about. But other standard risks are delay. But the mechanisms for dealing with those things are well established under standard form contracts.
I think from the point of view that we see, the certainty that developers are looking for means that contractors have to price in contingency at large quantities at the moment. I mean, inflationary figures of 25% are being bandied around. And of course, what you alluded to earlier on is price decreases get kept within the contractor's packet, as it were, if the fluctuation clauses are not there in that form. So there is an upward, only a ratchet to that. Would you say that as being a potential risk?
Well, under the fluctuation clauses, it moves either way. The risk is shared. It deals both with inflation and deflation. So that's, those clauses are there to share the risk and not to punish one party unduly as opposed to the other one. So no, and yes, they have routinely been struck out for many years. That's because we've been living in a period of stable inflation, and therefore they've not been needed. And that's why two of the options in the most recent suite of JCTs, two of the fluctuation options, A and C, I can't remember which of the two it is, have been removed, although they can be put back in, but they're not even produced as part of the standard form because of those long periods of stable inflation. But that's changed now.
If I might just ask you a question about the developer from the lender's point of view, does the form of contract, when these things are changing, does that cause you concern in terms of the risk exposure and willingness to lend, I suppose, is the question?
I suppose it's always just going to come down to the level of due diligence on that contractor, and not just their experience, but also their financial stability. As Tim alluded to, there are quite a lot of contractors who are coming under financial pressure. So ensuring that they are financially stable is one of the most fundamental parts, as well as can they deliver that project.
But in terms of seeing forms of contract being selected, do you have are there alarm bells ringing when you see these things changing in terms of the inevitability of the outcome, or is it something that you're comfortable that the lawyer and the contract administrator will have resolved at the beginning?
I suppose from a lender's perspective, there's always been a preference for fixed price contracts because it gives them that protection. But if you're building in the right levels of contingency, you've got the right team in place, then those sort of the JCT contracts that are in place, I presume they can be variable, and you can look at considering different options as long as the right level of due diligence has been done.
Can I just make one just to point out that the idea of a fixed price contract is a bit of a misnomer, whether you've got things like fluctuation clauses or not. The price inevitably changes because things happen, variations or delay or whatever. So,
well, that leads very nicely to the. Sorry, did you want?
Yeah, I was
sorry,
going to jump in actually. Just on the due diligence the banks are making at the moment. One thing we've seen recently with some of the contractors that have struggled is that you need to check into the previous deals that they've done, that they've just come out the back of, because some of them they've had to absorb quite extensive overruns and costs in those other contracts. So they may have been strong previously, but in this very moment in time, because of previous bad contracts that they've had to pick up, they're weak at the moment as they come into their next contract. So there is something that's sort of getting knocked forward that needs to be considered as well. So it's just something else for the bank to take into account, really.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, one of the things that we've done some analysis, and the assumption that the contractor can wear the fluctuations or wear the variations in pricing is we're long since past that, with potential lurching of more than double their margin, and it's already a tough market for most contractors to work in. So on that basis, Tim, I mean, are we seeing, and if so, why do we see disputes relating to fluctuation provisions? Is it just we're not familiar with them, or is it that these things are loaded rifles that we are pointing at ourselves sometimes?
well, I think disputes with fluctuations provisions, they aren't numerous at the moment because, as we were saying a moment ago, most standard form contracts for a very long time have not included them. So they're getting put into them now, particularly, and so disputes will arise in the future. But disputes over fluctuation clauses typically arise, I think, firstly because the parties may have forgotten the original reason they were put in there. It was in a spirit of risk share. And when times get hard and parties start to scramble for a position, they forget why they put them in there. And so you need to remember that they were put in there for that reason, and therefore you should implement them in that same philosophy. Whether you're entitled to them, whether in situations of delay is often a cause for disagreement, although your clause should be able to very clearly deal with that to say, if the contract's overrunning and therefore a party is culpable for that, the normal rules of fluctuation should or shouldn't apply. So be very clear about that. I think the other main reason why you often get disputes in those clauses is because they can be very complex. and to have them clearly and concisely drafted at the outset will help with that, because as we all know, where there is doubt and uncertainty, that's a breeding ground for disputes.
I think one of the things, I'm an ex-contractor, worked in the fast-track fit-out world, and I'm very aware that we were less than assiduous in looking at the contract and the contract amendments. We were more concerned about winning the work and at the end of it getting on with delivering it. Yeah. And I think people are now seeing the benefit in a bit of upfront investment, certainly in advice from their legal counsel and talking to commercially minded people like ourselves now. The benefit of that extra investment early on does seem to be landing with let's say the more agile and more astute developers and the smarter contractors as well. So
yeah, I mean, I think that's absolutely right. But you can negotiate as thoroughly as you like at the outset and put in place a detailed contract. If you don't then implement it, then the original negotiation is largely a bit of a waste of time.
Yeah, that's the long-standing plaintive cry, isn't it? Like, there is a contract. A, did you read it? And B, did you sign it properly? And did everybody understand what they were signing up to? So I think that actually drives an interesting point here, which is about the balancing the desire that a developer has for making profit against or certainty rather, and the contractor making profit. And that's a diametrically opposed tension, and clearly, and that's a natural part of the process. I think one of the things we see is a move away from the adversarial nature of contracting, especially in the smaller kind of area. People are seeing more partnering, informally or formally. We're seeing more collaboration, and there's certainly something that I think we're encouraging as a business is that people have a more open and transparent relationship within the contractual relationship that they have now. One of the things we've been saying to developers is you can't mitigate risk by pushing it down to the contractor and expect to retain control and expect to retain all the margin. You know, someone has to take the risk and someone will take the margin in order to cover that risk. I suspect a lot of what we've seen over the last few years is that's moved further and further down the chain to subcontractors who have held the risk, held the margin, and in some cases actually are probably dictating the terms under which a contract can be delivered. So I think that's a really interesting perspective, and hopefully it shows a change in the attitude and culture within the industry, because the adversarial nature serves people not very well sometimes, I think.
Yeah, I mean, certainly from what I see at the end of a life of a business, when it's struggled and it's starting to look at restructuring options, a lot of those problems have come from the discourse between the contractor and the employer and the subbies maybe along the line as well. You know, we can only encourage collaboration and communication, you know, amongst all the parties, and I still think it's got a long way to go. Yeah. You know, I know you mentioned that it's getting better, but we're in troubled times now, and I think if anybody's going to get to the end of these projects and people are going to have to make a profit, people cannot be greedy. You know, they've got to leave enough skin in the game for everybody to get through, and the funders have got to get involved as well. You know, then maybe they've got to lend a little bit of additional money to get people over the line and get these projects completed so that people can come out the other side, lick their wounds, make a little bit of profit, and then go again. Because if people take too much of the pie, somebody's going to be left out the game and they won't be there to work the next job. So collaboration and communication is absolutely key from where I'm sitting.
Yeah, I think this is started with the Latham report, and we're seeing probably the scale and scope of that coming down to smaller and more nimble and agile partnering, as it were. Sorry, I was just going to say one last thing on that, which is that one of the areas that people have to exercise some caution is it's good forming strong partnerships, but you've got to make sure the partnership doesn't go stale, and that let's say, imagine it's the contractor starts to ease a more, I feel like, generous margin within the relationship, because they are trusted, and that's something that, you know, we tend to be mindful of.
Yeah, I was only going to add on the sort of partnering versus the confrontational philosophies. Of course, from a lawyer's point of view, there's the perfect tool right at the heart of all of this for high levels of adversity in the form of adjudication. Yeah. Very easy to start, very little risk in terms of you don't have to bear the other party's costs, and you can do it at any time. So to have that tool right there in the middle of all of this often makes it hard to avoid the adversity, the adversarial nature of relationships.
We sometimes get, because a lot of the work we do in dispute resolution and conflict resolution, people will sort of look at me sideways when we say we try very hard to hit the brake, not the accelerator, when it comes to the conflict that sometimes happens and the disputes that come as a result of that. And what I was trying to point out to them is that most of the time these conflicts get settled from a clumsy and crude commercial position. We'll meet you halfway and let's shake hands and never work together again. And actually, from the other point of view, the larger stuff will always happen. There will always be the disputes at the larger end where our services at that expert level are required, because construction is a complex process. It's the stuff that could be more easily resolved with a more informed, negotiated position, I think is perhaps where we want to encourage people to go. And actually, what we say is that if you spend a bit more money up front with the expert advice from people like yourselves and experts like us, you actually are less likely to get into low-level or lower-level dispute work. Would you agree with that?
I would agree with that, but with all these things, it often comes down to people. And if someone is, for whatever reason, not minded to act that way, and a lot of people aren't, that those bad habits can surface whatever your contract says, especially if you're under huge financial pressure.
Absolutely. And which, of course, the industry is at the moment. So, Mike, I think it's almost a self-evident question here, is that asking why the cost of financing is increasing, given what's happened in the last few weeks. But perhaps you could give us, from a lender's point of view, that perspective.
So I suppose the short answer, and if I want to keep it really short, would just be inflation, and the one-word answer. I suppose what's worth bearing in mind is that every bank, their pricing model is different. So the way they get to their rates is always done differently. Obviously, well aware that Bank of England rate is increasing. That's being increased as a way of trying to curb inflation and prices from running away a little bit. Obviously, as that increases, those who are borrowing against Bank of England base rate will see their borrowing go up as that lending reference rate goes up. But lenders also require liquidity, so a lot of them will go into the market and take deposits from individuals. Yeah. Now, as there's a fight for those deposits and they're paying greater and greater interest rates, to offset that, they then got to charge greater rates to the ultimate borrowers to offset that and to make a profit. And then there's also perceived risk. So some of the lenders will also price higher when there's a greater perceived level of risk. And in the current market that we're in at the moment, with costs going up, interest rates rising, delays, there's inherently quite a lot of risk at the moment. So again, that's going to push prices even higher. And I suppose finally as well, banks have also got the higher overheads as much as anyone else has, higher gas, electric bills, higher staffing costs, higher rent. And they need to continue to make a profit. So those costs have to be borne into the rates that are ultimately charged to the borrower.
It's interesting. We provide project monitoring, development monitoring, however it might be. And I'm aware that the developers are very keen to borrow and the lenders are very keen to lend. But there seems to be quite a gap in the middle between bringing the two sides to a point where they find that equal. And that's presumably all about risk and liquidity of the borrowing. Is it getting more competitive, or is it less so because perhaps people are less willing to take those risks?
At the moment, it's still very competitive. There's still a lot of lenders out there who are looking to lend. Secure Trust Bank is still very open to lending against development projects, but they are becoming more challenging to get development projects that make sense from a cost perspective and a profit perspective. Making sure that there's sufficient contingency in there, for example. Trying to make sure that it's the right thing for both parties and not just the bank. It's a tricky conversation to have at the moment.
It's also interesting that there's a demand for product. Perhaps the product is changing, perhaps it's evolving over time. But in that point of view, of course, the more pressure there is on to deliver, the more exposure to risk and therefore the more likelihood. So, I mean, one of the questions I was going to ask about this is about mitigating against insolvency. I mean, you've alluded to loan to value. Yeah. What other measures are you seeing out there in terms of tools that you can bring to the table?
So typically one of the most popular was the fixed price contract. It would protect the developer from those fluctuations in cost of materials, and but obviously that's, as Tim said, it's becoming more challenging now, and with the contracts that are being put in place. I suppose, as I hinted at earlier, due diligence is probably the most important thing for a bank to protect itself, is to make sure that not only are you doing the due diligence on the developer, but on the contractor, their ability to deliver that project and their financial capabilities to deliver that project. If they've entered into a fixed price contract, are they going to be able to deliver that if prices increase? And then contingency is a very important thing, making sure that level of contingency is right. As you said, inflation, some of the prices of materials have gone up 25%. That's quite a jump. So if some of the older levels of 5% contingency are in place, that's eroded very, very quickly. So as a bank, so Secure Trust Bank, for instance, we're making a minimum of 10% contingency on our projects, and that's got to cover fluctuation in materials. If there is a fixed price contract in place, we may need to consider, do we need to lend more to, if in the event that it's looking like a contractor's going bust, for instance. And then we know interest rates are going to be probably 2% higher this time next year. So during the life of that development project, interest rates will go up. So costs are increasing.
I think it's also useful for the banks to go along for the ride, and be party to that project as it's being built out, and be aware of any pinch points that are coming down the road, rather than suddenly get a phone call 6 months later saying it's all gone bandy and we're in trouble. If the bank are there and invested in it, which a lot of banks are, and I imagine Secure Trust are as well, but if the banks are invested all the way through the project, I think then there's going to be no surprises, and I think they'll be more comfortable then in perhaps helping the project over the line if those contingencies have been squeezed and they need a few more percent. If the bank are invested from the start to the end, then they should feel that they understand the project and they will see it through.
So avoiding expensive maze finance and expensive bridging finance, that sort of thing.
You're just looking at this moment in time. Again, it comes back to my collaboration point, is that I think if people can be party to it all the way through, then they understand the project, and it's not just coming to them on a piece of paper with some cash flow projections and we suddenly need another £250,000 to see this thing through. They're probably already ahead of that, and they're thinking ahead that they are going to be asked for this in the future, so they possibly already prepared for it. I think that's helpful.
Tim, as a sort of supplementary to that, are you seeing main contractors and subcontractors having more robust back-to-back contracting in terms of that process, or is it something that doesn't necessarily express itself well?
No, well, yes, the back-to-back backing up of contracts is still the sensible default position. But I think you said right at the beginning, a subcontractor wants to make sure that the risk isn't just being kicked down the road towards them. So, you've got to make a point that we've already made, which is share the risk. Don't put it all in one place, because that ultimately doesn't help anyone. It's a very short-term view if you think by putting it all on everyone else, it's going to be great.
Surely, yeah, absolutely. So that actually leads us to a really interesting question here, which is about what do we think collectively should be the case if it's evident that a contractor's underpriced a project and is in the middle of delivering it. I mean, perhaps has underpriced it because in retrospect the pricing of materials and labour has gone up so much. What do we think is the best approach for a developer?
Well, again, if that situation arises, which is quite common and is going to have particularly significant impact in the current climate, you've got to work out whether you think you can get through the project with this contractor, or whether you think ultimately you're going to it's not going to work and you have to go your separate ways. So you're going to have to work out whether you need to renegotiate the price, whether you can accommodate them in areas that you wouldn't financially have accommodated them previously. Yeah, so basically it's a decision between, well, is this going to create a problem so big that we're going to have to go our separate ways, or can we muddle through this together and try and get to that decision as soon as you can?
I suppose from the bank's perspective, we just want early engagement as soon as possible. If it seems like something's not going quite right, then speak to us and tell us, because the sooner we know about it, the sooner we can start preparing for it and planning and working with you to try and get round it, because the ramifications of a contractor going bust, can be quite difficult because, delays, trying to find another contractor who's just as good. In the meantime, you're paying more interest to the bank. You're paying probably more interest on MES funding. Early engagement so that we can try and work together and work out what is the best option for all parties concerned, really.
I've seen figures that have been quoted that if a contract is terminated, the on cost of re-establishing that is something up to 30% of the value of the contract, and that's a very scary number indeed. So it makes sense to do all the clever stuff before you actually get to that point if you can. So with lots of nods around the table here.
Totally. Totally agree.
Okay. And I think one of the points I was going to say from our point of view is that the reintroduction of fluctuation clauses, or let's just say re-enabling of them, that's probably one of the best ways of looking at underpricing, and at least, as I would say to a developer, just because you see the contractors underpriced, that's not necessarily in your interests. Everyone's entitled to make a margin, everyone's entitled to make a profit, and being reasonable is a lot better than being, taking advantage, as it were. So I think that, again, lots of nods around the table there. So, Brian, what risks should directors of contractors and developers be thinking about when going through financial difficulties? We started the conversation there about that. What's your...
Yeah, I think that, there's two risks fundamentally. I think one is that their company is going to go bust if it all goes wrong, and that is obviously going to have a major impact on all the staff, the company, the directors, their families, everybody associated with that. But then, of course, there's also then the personal risk. Most companies are set up as entities that are limited liability companies, so they've got that protection. But then the thing they have to be very wary of is when it gets into the insolvency field and the grey area of when you should have been aware that your company was insolvent or wouldn't be able to trade through the position that you're in. That then can open up risk of personal liability that comes from an insolvent company. So directors have to be very, very on the ball. It's a difficult place to be as a director of a company that's in difficulty. They've got all these contracts to go through. They've got all the margins, contingencies, everything, deal with the bank, build the thing as well and make a profit and keep the wife happy and keep everybody else happy. And now they've got to think about personal liability as well if things start going wrong. And it's very, very tricky. When you get into that grey area now, they've got to be mindful of preference payments. If they've only got a limited amount of money to go round, who do they pay? Who do they choose to pay? In the insolvency world, in the event that the company does enter into liquidation or administration or another insolvency procedure, the likes of myself and the insolvency practitioners can then go back to look at see the way the directors conducted themselves in the months leading up to that insolvent position, and if they've been found to be acted badly as directors in they've preferred other people to treating all the creditors equally, then they have a problem. When you go into a business as a director, you're there to act in the best interest of the company. When the position changes and you're insolvent, that duty changes to acting in the best interest of all the creditors as a whole. So you then have to suddenly think about all of that as well. So you've got to think about preference, you've got to think about entering into any transactions that, maybe you're selling somebody assets to fund a job, but you're selling those assets at undervalue. Mm-hmm. That's not in the best interest of all the creditors. So there's a myriad of things that they've got to be mindful of as well. But there's ways that they can mitigate that, which they can talk about. I've talked earlier on about collaboration and communication. It's having all the relevant information to hand. A good director is very much on the ball. He's got all the up-to-date management information. He's got his cash flow forecasts, but not just the cash flow forecasts that were produced at the outset of the job. They need to be continually updated. Interest rates change, supplies change, cost of materials change. All of that should be continually rehashed into up-to-date cash flow forecasts so they can see where the pinch points are coming and talk to the bank well in advance. The banks don't like surprises. They like to be given fair warning when their support may be required. So directors need to be really on the ball. The secret really is to hold regular board meetings and minutes what you do. I mean, that's probably the most important thing is, I mean, most of us, when we do our jobs, we're in control, we know what we're doing, but it's all in our heads. When it comes to somebody like me knocking on the door and saying, well, why did you do this 6 months ago? If you've had it written down, or there's an email trail, or there's board minutes, then you can refer back to that. There's stressful times when a business is starting to struggle, so write it all down so that you're not going to get caught out by an insolvency practitioner somewhere down the line.
I think we would echo that in the world of disputes. One of the most frustrating things is the lack of record keeping. But in the muck and bullets of delivering projects, that when we're going back and trying to do the forensic analysis of it, finding information, why decisions were made at any one time and what was informing them is often the most challenging part of it. I think you would agree, would you, Tim?
Absolutely. And given that there's so many different methods of communication these days, including Snapchat, WhatsApp and all the rest of it, to keep good records of all of that and the metadata and preserve all of that is very important and usually not done terribly well.
No, quite right. So I think we've actually covered quite a lot of the good ground here. And has anyone got anything they want to add that we haven't mentioned today that particularly might, from your perspective as businesses?
I would only add really that we are starting to see a lot of construction companies under pressure. And it's important that they reach out to their advisors for that guidance and that support. Again, it comes down to collaboration. I mean, we will all get through this. There's going to be some bumpy months ahead. But the directors don't have to do it all on their own. No. There's people out there that can help them. And some of us are old enough that we've seen it before. So, we may be quite useful in this time. Yeah.
So, have you got any perspective from the lender's point of view that you just want to, sort of, as a conclusion, as a point of view to add?
No, I suppose it's just as important for the developers to be doing their due diligence as it is us. So I've spoken about us doing our due diligence on the contractors and suppliers. I would make sure that the developers are doing that and making sure that they've got all of their bases covered and, keeping a pot of cash to one side so that if things do go wrong, they have got a plan B rather than trying to borrow everything.
Interesting. Tim, anything to add to that?
To be honest, I don't think so. No,
okay, brilliant. I think we've covered a lot of ground here. If I just wind up with that, I see one of the questions is forms of contract. That's the getting the right advice early on. Yeah. Spending a bit more at the beginning is better than trying to fight the argument halfway down the road, as it were. Much more about collaboration and cooperation and trust. Building trust by partnering, or even informally or formally, and that would be really important. Transparency seems to be a big thing. The ability. It's only if you're looking at other forms of contract, the trust that you have to show the other side what exactly it is costing you, and that's, I think, very, very important. And I think we've got to look at this and say this is, as you say, a transient moment. We'll get out of it. With the other side of it, we'll all be going, well, what was that all about? But we've got to get there first. And clearly, construction still has to press on, and it has done very well during the course of the last few months and years. So I think we've spoken about a lot of the things that seem to be evolving, especially in the more agile and better thinking.
Yeah, and to bear in mind that these are extraordinary times, having come through a pandemic and now into this. These aren't typical times. Even when there are bad times, these are fairly atypical times.
Indeed. Gents, thanks. I've really enjoyed the conversation with you. I hope you have as well.
Thank you.
Thanks.